This is Woodside Church Kids.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's video. My name is Matty and this is for the kids in Engage. Last week we looked at the story of Joseph, about his time in Egypt from slave to then being the ruler of Egypt. And this, at the end of that story, we learned that Joseph's family actually all moved to Egypt, all of his 11 brothers and their children and his father. And this week's story actually takes off from there in the second book of the Bible called Exodus. And in chapter 1 we read that the Israelites had many children and grandchildren, and in fact they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Now the first word there, Israelites, is a word you might have heard before but are not necessarily sure what it means. The Israelites is basically just all of Joseph's family. It was the name for all of Joseph's family and their children and their children and their children and so on. And so these Israelites were becoming so numerous, there were so many of them, that the Egyptians actually were getting a little bit worried, because they thought, well, if there's so many of them, they could actually take over the country. So the Pharaoh made a couple of plans. First, he made the Israelites slaves so they would work for him instead of trying to overthrow him. And then secondly, when that didn't really work, he came up with a plan to actually kill all of the Hebrew boys, all of the new boys. And this way they wouldn't have enough people to try and overthrow his rule. But lots of the Israelites, there was an Israelite lady who had a baby, and she saw that he was a special baby. So she actually tried to protect him. She made a basket out of papyrus reeds and then waterproofed it. And she put the baby in the basket and left it on the reeds on the bank of the river. So she took a basket and made it float and put the baby in it so that he would be safe from the Egyptians who were trying to kill him. And soon the Pharaoh's daughter, so the king of Egypt himself, his daughter came down to bathe in the river and found the basket in the reeds on the side, and she opened it and saw the baby, and she actually took this baby in, and by God's plan, the nanny for this baby was actually Moses' own mother, and the princess, named the baby Moses. And years later, when Moses grew up, he went out to visit his people, the Israelites, or another name for them was the Hebrews. And in fact, he saw how badly the Hebrews were being treated, and he killed one of the Egyptian people who was hurting one of those people. And this made the Pharaoh quite angry, because he'd killed an Egyptian person, and he actually tried to kill Moses. But Moses escaped and lived in a different place in the land called Midian. Now Moses grew up and had his own life here. He got married and had children, became a shepherd. And one day he led his flock of sheep to the wilderness and came to Mount Sinai, which is the mountain of God. And there the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Now you might have heard this story before, and you would know that what was special about this bush wasn't just that it was on fire, but the bush wasn't burning up. So this fire was around the whole thing, but it wasn't becoming black and charring and bits were falling off. The bush was fine, but was still on fire. And Moses went to take a closer look, and he heard the voice of God say to him, "Moses, Moses." God was speaking directly to Moses from this bush. And God said, "I've certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt." God was saying, I've heard that they are suffering. I've heard they're really not having a good time in being slaves and worked way too hard by the people in Egypt. And so he said to Moses, "Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people out of Egypt." God told Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. And now God has spoken directly to Moses from a burning bush, and Moses says to God, "Who am I to appear before the Pharaoh?" But God said, "Look, I don't really mind who you are, because I will be with you." And then Moses said, "But if I go, they're going to ask me who sent me." And God again says, "Look, I am who I am." I've actually got a bookmark here in my Bible because I love that passage. God says, "I am who I am." I'm not defined by things that you might say about me. God is who God is. He's kind of his own thing. We can't really describe him properly. God is who God is. And so then Moses protests again. God is telling him to go, and Moses is like, but wait. He says, "What if they don't believe me or won't listen?" And so God says, "Perform this sign," and tells him how to turn his staff, his shepherd's staff, into a snake. And he does some other miracles and says, "Look, here you go, here are these miracles. they're going to believe you. And Moses again says, but wait, Lord, I'm not very good with words. And God actually gets angry at this point because he is telling Moses to go and Moses is trying to find ways out of it. He says, who makes a person's mouth and who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, or see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? God is saying, look, I made you. You can't tell me that you're not very good at speaking when I've told you to speak, because I have made you the way that I want you to be. I will be with you whenever you try and do things that I've told you to do. And then Moses, his desperate plea is, Lord, please send anyone else. And the Lord is really angry because he's asked Moses to go. He's told Moses himself to go. And Moses just doesn't believe that he can do it. So God actually says, look, use your brother, bring your brother with you, and he can help speak for you. And so Moses took his wife and his sons and put them on a donkey and headed back to Egypt. And in his hand, he carried the staff that God had told him how to turn it into a snake. And that's the end of, that's where I'm going to leave our story off in the Bible this week. But we know that the story actually continues. We learned about a few weeks over the Passover, where God persuades Pharaoh to let his people go through a series of miracles that just came upon Egypt. And Moses led God's people out of Egypt. And he led them to the promised land, which was the land of Canaan that we learned about a couple of weeks ago, where this was the land that God promised to give to Abraham. So now Abraham's children and grandchildren are promised to go back into this land when they escape from Egypt. See, Moses argued with God in our story. He was afraid. He said he couldn't speak very well. He said, but what if they don't believe me? But God had chosen Moses, and God said, constantly, God said that he would help him. See, Moses really didn't believe in himself. He didn't think he was good enough to do God's work. And this kind of still applies to us today. Sometimes there are challenges that we face that we think God has told us to do something, and we think that we're not good enough to be able to do it. We come up with excuses. We're not very confident. We don't have enough stuff to be able to do that. But if God tells you to do something, he tells you because he knows that you can do it. And he tells you because he's going to be with you and help you through it. And so that's the story of Moses and why it's still important for us today. And that's it for this week's story. In Woodside Kids Weekly, I've actually got a couple of challenges for you to try this week, looking at different objects in your house and whether they float or not, just like Moses' mum made the basket float when she put him in at the side of the river. This week's activity is a puzzle that you can colour in and cut out and try and piece back together again. And this week's craft is looking at Moses' time in the basket. Even when he was in the basket, God had a plan for him and knew what his life was going to be like. Even putting his mum as his own nanny, which I think is just really crazy. I love that God had planned it so carefully that his own mum was his nanny when he was growing up in the palace. And so this week's craft is making our own little basket things. I love seeing the kind of stuff you can come up with. So if you've got any pictures of what you get up to, send them to me at my email address. And so until next week, keep well, help at home, and chat to Jesus. Bye.